Okay, we're going to look at some data inside RealWorks. So we're assuming that we completed the auto registration refinement inside Trimble Perspective, exported back to capture, and then generated a capture file. And you can see here's the file that I'm going to be working with, RealWorks test X7. So this data came from an X7. GR, meaning this is a georeferenced data set. We are not going to move any of the stations inside RealWorks because if we do that, that's a little bit different workflow. So here's our .capture file. I right-clicked and then I extracted the scan data, and then that produced this file folder, which in here. So this is our TDX, and TDX is a Trimble Data Exchange. It's just a proprietary format. So that's what we're going to be importing into RealWorks. So I have RealWorks open. I'm going to open my files, make sure that I'm on Trimble 3D scan files. I'm going to look for my file folder, the georeferenced, and then there's our TDX. When I open this, it's always going to say it has to be saved first, so I'm going to go out and save this. I created a RealWorks folder in here. I'm going to call this georeferenced. Okay, so that imports the file, the TDX file. So we actually need to generate the scan data. So there's a couple different ways to do that. Sampling by step, you have steps 1 through 5. To keep it simple, 1 would be all points available, and 5 would be like a factor of 5. So it would be like 1/5 the amount of data points versus the 1. So 1 would be all the details, and 5 would be 1/5 of the details. Typically, we want all the details. You can also do a sampling, a spatial sampling, so you can actually tell it what the distance is between two point cloud points in a point cloud. So I'm just going to leave this at 1. It's going to go through here and render all of this. And you can see TZF, so that's the raw proprietary files coming from the scanner. So it needs to render these files. It should not take very long. It should take a minute, maybe 2, depends on your computer. And then once it's completed, you'll see all these completed stations here. Okay, so that completed, took 27 seconds. I'll close that. And now we're looking at our data. You can see that it is georeferenced properly. We have all of our stations here. The RPs were our ground control points. So if I were going to, there's a couple things you can do. You can do classification, you can do segmentation. There's several things that you can do in here. So currently we're in the registration module of Trimble RealWorks. So anything registration, any refinement of the stations, that's going to be done in this registration module. Anything like classification, segmentation, we need to switch over to the production. And you can see when I switch over to production, I have my project cloud, which includes 19 million points. It is currently not visible, so we need to turn on our little light bulb, and then we'll see the same thing. So just to give you a quick run through of some of these tools, if I wanted to, let's say, classify Well, let's do this first. Let's make our project area first. So that's going to be a segmentation. In order to do any segmentation, you have to have the cloud selected. So as soon as I select the cloud, it puts a nice yellow rectangular box around it. So as soon as I do that, it's going to open up the ability to segmentate. And then I can do a polygon, I can do a rectangle. I'll just keep it easy and do a rectangle. Like if I were going to get my project or my scene area. Left click, so there's my area. I can go in or I can go out. So if I wanted to go, if I had the green check to go in, everything inside the box is going to stay. If I did the red X, everything inside the box is not going to stay. We're basically saying we want this out or we want it in. For this, I want it in because I'm trying to create my working area. So I'm going to say in, and then I need to create this object cloud. So I need to hit this create. As soon as I do that, it's going to create just an arbitrary name for that segmented cloud. If I were to close this tool, so there is, right now it's called object 1, but that's my kind of my working area. So I can go to the properties and I can say, case number. Okay, so now I have my working area. And we intentionally had, people walking around. So if I wanted to get rid of that, there is kind of an easy button. So classification will set kind of classes for areas. So like ground will be put on one classification layer. Buildings will be put on another classification layer. It has to do with the laser intensity of that surface. A lot of these, so this is us kind of walking around when it's scanning. This is kind of ghosting and it's garbage. We do not want it in there. So typically, ghosting, I go into my edit. If I go to my auto classify, that should get rid of most or all of this garbage. Especially if we're walking around, it's really hard for the software to classify something that doesn't have any consistency. Some of these were pretty stationary, so it'll be interesting how it turns out. But this is an outdoor scene, so I'm going to auto classify outdoor. We have all of these classes, so we could say I want all of these on different classification layers. I'm going to keep things easy, and I'm going to do just the ground and remaining. So in a perfect world, this garbage or this ghosting that we don't want in there, it should go on this remaining layer, meaning it's not really, you can't classify it. So I'm going to extract this and see what happens. And I've done this before. I don't think all of this comes out, all the people or the ghosting. It did. So this rendering is by color-coded classification. So brown would be the classification for ground. Turn this back to true color. So it did a really good job of getting rid of all of those, all the noise, all the people. So you can see if I turn back on that remaining, Now, we did lose some of the, we had a light pole here, we had some other things there. So I'm sure that if I did more of the classification layers for the auto classification, the pole, there was a light pole here, that probably would have been on poles and signs. But this is just kind of a quick example. So when I export, I would not export this remaining layer. So that's one way. If I wanted to say, if they didn't auto-classify out, then you could go to something like a limit box where you can say, and just select, so this is a person here. You can then isolate this, and this could also be for like if you had, vehicles that you wanted to isolate, you could do the same thing. This little slider. So just getting the feet. So I can then make sure I have a cloud selected. I could say segmentation. Right now it's on a box selection. So a box selection, you can only keep items in. That's fine. So in and out, you kind of have to be careful. Kind of have to pick one way or the other. But if I did say in, and I created that, close my limit box. I then created a new object cloud. And maybe I would call this, garbage. So that's going to end up being, a object layer that we're not going to export. You can see it here. I have the cars. Maybe I was going to isolate those cars and put them on their own object layer. There's a lot of things you can do with classification. But if I was just looking to get just the ground, it does a really good job of just getting the ground. And then I will, so that's all I'm going to do here. I'm going to show you some of the exports a little bit later. So this was a auto-registered data set inside Perspective. We did not do any refinement to these stations or move the stations at all.